The morning I found out the coffee was still hot, that detail stayed with me for months afterward, the absurd, cruel normalcy of it. Steam rising from the mug he had made before he left for work. 2 sugars, a little oat milk, exactly the way I liked it. The mug sitting on the kitchen counter like a small, warm lie, like everything else in our apartment, like everything else in our life together. His name, the name I knew him by, was Daniel Reeves, except it wasn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. And even then, I'm not sure it does. I met Daniel on a Tuesday in October, 4 years and 3 months before the morning the coffee was still hot, and my entire world collapsed in a single phone call. I was 23. I had just moved to the city 6 weeks earlier, fresh out of grad school with a communications degree, a duffel bag full of optimism, and exactly one friend in a place of 11 million people. I was working at a small editorial company, proofreading articles about celebrity diets and home renovation trends, and I was profoundly, quietly lonely in the way that young people in big cities sometimes are surrounded by noise and movement, and still somehow completely invisible. I went to a bookshop on a Tuesday evening because I had nothing else to do, and because bookshops had always felt like the safest kind of loneliness. Surrounded by other people's stories, warm lighting, the smell of paper. Nobody expected you to talk. He was standing in the fiction aisle with a copy of Giovanni's Room open in his hands. I noticed him the way you notice a painting, all at once, involuntarily, with a small catch of breath you don't quite mean to release. He was tall, maybe 6'1", with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples, and the kind of face that looked like it belonged in a film rather than a bookshop in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. But it wasn't just the way he looked. It was the way he was reading, completely absorbed, utterly still, lips moving faintly with the words, like the rest of the world had simply stopped existing for him. I reached past him for a book I didn't actually want and knocked 2 others off the shelf in the process. He caught one before it hit the ground. I caught the other. We straightened up at the same time and found ourselves about 8 inches apart, and he smiled at me, this slow, slightly amused, genuinely warm smile, and said, "Good reflexes." "Terrible reach," I said. He laughed. A real laugh, not polite. And that was it. That was the whole beginning of 4 years of my life. His name was Daniel Reeves. He was 26, an architect working at a mid-sized firm downtown. He was from a small town in Vermont, had moved to the city 3 years ago, loved Gabriel Garcia Marquez and old Springsteen records and obscure Japanese films. He was funny in a quiet way, thoughtful in a loud way. He remembered details about things you said weeks after you'd said them. He brought you coffee exactly the way you liked it without being asked. He left notes on the bathroom mirror. He held your hand in public without making it a statement, just naturally, warmly, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I fell in love with him in the way I imagine most people fall in love, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, irreversibly, like water finding its level. By February we were inseparable. By summer I had a drawer in his apartment. By the following year I had moved in entirely, and the apartment had become ours, my books on his shelves, his coffee mug next to mine, our names on a lease together, our lives wound so tightly around each other that I genuinely could not remember, at times, where I ended and he began. 4 years. 4 years of Tuesday evenings and Sunday mornings, and arguing about whose turn it was to buy groceries and laughing at bad movies and holding each other through hard weeks. 4 years of knowing someone or believing you did, which turns out to be a different thing entirely. The first sign in retrospect was the phone. Daniel was not secretive about his phone. That was the confusing part. He didn't hide it face down on tables or take calls in other rooms or flinch when I walked past him while he was texting. He was relaxed about it in a way that felt completely natural. I never had a reason to look, and so I never looked, but there were moments. Small ones easy to explain away. Once, about 2.5 years in, I borrowed his phone to look something up because mine had died, and he handed it over without hesitation. But I noticed, just for a second, that he navigated away from something before he passed it to me. I didn't think much of it. Everyone has things on their phone they'd rather not share on reflex. It didn't mean anything. Except that over the following year, I began to collect these moments the way you collect loose change, individually meaningless, but accumulating quietly into something with weight. The work trips that seemed slightly more frequent than I remembered them being before. He worked in architecture. Travel wasn't unusual, but it started to feel like it was always somewhere I couldn't quite picture. Pittsburgh, then Cincinnati, then a 2-week stretch in Miami I hadn't known about until 4 days before he left. I asked once if I could come, just for a long weekend. He was warm about it, apologetic, said the client was intense and he'd be working most of the time and it would be miserable for me. I believed him because Daniel was the kind of person whose explanations always felt reasonable. The night, 8 months before the end, when his phone rang at 2 in the morning and he got up to answer it in the hallway and came back 15 minutes later with the quiet, slightly sealed expression of someone who has just put something carefully away. I asked who it was. He said it was a colleague in a different time zone, something about a project deadline. He kissed my forehead and lay back down, and his breathing evened out into sleep within 10 minutes, and I lay in the dark next to him staring at the ceiling wondering why my chest felt tight. I told myself I was being paranoid. Relationship anxiety. Attachment issues dressed up as intuition. I had a therapist who might have helped me parse the difference if I had told her any of it, but I didn't, because saying it out loud would have made it real, and I didn't want it to be real. I wanted Daniel. I wanted our apartment and our lease and our coffee mugs and our life. I wanted it badly enough to convince myself that the tightness in my chest was my problem, not his. The month before everything collapsed, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than that, which was almost worse. He became slightly, subtly withdrawn, not cold, not distant enough for me to point at and say, look, something is wrong here, just a few degrees cooler. Laughing a beat too late, answering questions with the right words but without the fullness behind them. Looking at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't name, something that might have been guilt if I had been looking for it, but that I mistook for tiredness because that was the more bearable interpretation. I asked him once directly. I sat across from him at our kitchen table with my hands wrapped around my coffee mug and I said, "Is everything okay? With us, I mean, you seem, I don't know." Far away lately. He looked at me for a moment, and this is the part that comes back to me again and again, the part I replay compulsively in the dark. He looked at me with something in his eyes that I now understand was the specific pain of a person who has been lying to someone they love and has not yet figured out how to stop. And then he reached across the table and put his hand over mine and he said, "I'm fine. Work is just complicated right now. I love you, you know that." I said yes, I said I knew, I believed him. The phone call came on a Thursday morning in January. Daniel had left for work an hour earlier. He had made coffee. He had kissed me on the temple. He had said he'd be home by 7 and maybe they could order Thai and watch something. A completely ordinary Thursday morning in a completely ordinary life. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop when the call came. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, and then I did, because sometimes unknown numbers are important, and I had learned not to ignore them entirely. "Is this Marcus Webb?" A woman's voice. Clear, measured, controlled, the voice of someone who had prepared very carefully for this conversation. "Yes," I said. "Who is this?" A pause, just long enough to make my hand tighten around the phone without knowing why. "My name is Caroline Harmon," she said. "I'm calling because I'm married to a man named Jonathan Harmon. I believe you know him as Daniel Reeves." The kitchen was very quiet. The steam rose from the coffee mug on the counter. "I'm sorry," I said. "What?" "I know this is difficult to hear," she said, and she sounded like she meant it, which was somehow the most disorienting thing about the whole conversation. "I want you to know that I'm not calling to attack you. You're not the person I'm angry with. But I needed you to know the truth, and I didn't know any other way to do this." I remember standing up, though I don't remember deciding to. I remember walking to the window and looking out at the street below and thinking, with a strange, dissociated clarity, that the city looked exactly the same as it always did, which felt obscene. "Tell me," I said. My voice sounded very far away to me. "Tell me everything." His name was Jonathan Harmon. He was 31 years old, 2 years older than the age he had told me he was. He was not from Vermont. He was from Connecticut, from a wealthy family with complicated expectations, which was relevant in ways I would understand later. He had grown up with a father who had built a financial empire over 40 years and who had made it abundantly clear, from the time Jonathan was old enough to understand such things, that the Harmon name would continue in a specific, traditional way. He had met Caroline in graduate school. They had married at 26, the same year I would later calculate that he had moved to the city. He had married her because his father expected it and because he had not yet figured out how to be the person he actually was. She was kind, she was accomplished, she was from the right family. She had not known, in the beginning, what she was part of. She had believed she was marrying a man who loved her. She had believed, perhaps, that love was something that could be willed into a particular shape if you worked hard enough. They had a house in a suburb 40 minutes outside the city. A real house, not an apartment. A yard. A dog, apparently, a golden retriever named Biscuit, which detail arrived in my mind and lodged there with an almost comical irrelevance. He commuted into the city 4 days a week. He was, in fact, an architect. That part was true. He worked at the firm. He was good at his job. His colleagues knew him as Jonathan, obviously, and none of them knew anything about a second life in an apartment downtown, about a man named Marcus who had a drawer and a coffee mug and a lease with a name that turned out not to be real. The work trips were mostly weekends, entire weekends that he spent with me in our apartment as Daniel, while Caroline believed he was traveling for work. Some of them were real trips, some of them were not. The late-night phone call 8 months ago had been Caroline. She had begun to suspect something was wrong. She had hired someone, she said this very matter-of-factly, not defensively. She had hired someone to look into things. It had taken 3 months. She had known the broad shape of the truth for 4 months before she called me. She had needed time, she said, to figure out what she wanted to do with the information. She had considered not telling me at all. She had considered telling me immediately. In the end, she had told me now because she had made her decision about her own marriage, and she felt that I deserved to make an informed decision about mine. Your own marriage, I said at some point during this conversation. What decision did you make? A pause. I'm leaving him, she said quietly. I told him last night. He knows I'm calling you today. He knows. I stood at the window for a very long time after she said that. He knows she's calling me, which meant he had woken up this morning knowing this call was coming. He had made coffee, 2 sugars and oat milk, knowing. He had kissed my temple and said he'd be home by 7 and maybe they could order Thai, knowing. He had looked me in the eyes and walked out the door knowing that by the time I finished my first cup of coffee, the woman he had also been building a life with for 4 years would call me, and the world, as I knew it, would no longer exist. I have to go, I told Caroline Harmon. I didn't say thank you, I didn't say anything else. I ended the call and I stood in our apartment, the apartment with my books on his shelves and my name on a lease next to a name that wasn't his, and I looked at the coffee mug still steaming on the counter and I thought, with the terrible, irrational specificity of shock, he made this before he knew everything was over. He made it anyway. That was the detail that broke me open, not the betrayal. Not the wife, the house, the dog, the 45 minutes of highway between the 2 lives he had been running in parallel for 4 years. Not the hundreds of lies, the constructed identity, the careful architecture of deception maintained with the same precision and skill he apparently brought to his actual architectural work. The coffee, made with care, out of habit, because that was who he was, or who Daniel was. This person he had invented and inhabited and made real through the accumulated weight of 4 years of small genuine kindnesses. A person who remembered how you took your coffee. A person who left notes on the bathroom mirror. A person who held your hand in public without making it a statement. A person who did not exist. He came home at 6:15, not 7. I was sitting on the couch when I heard his key in the lock, and I had spent the last 5 hours oscillating between a grief so physical it felt like illness and a cold, razor-edged clarity that I didn't entirely recognize as my own. I had cried. I had stopped crying. I had called my only close friend in the city, Priya, and she had come over and sat with me for 3 hours and then left when I asked her to, because I needed to do this part alone. I had not moved his things. I had not thrown anything. I had not done any of the dramatic things you imagine yourself doing in a situation like this, because the reality of it was too large for drama. Drama requires a kind of focused anger, and what I felt was much bigger and much less directed than anger. It was the feeling of the ground simply not being where you put your foot, of reaching for a wall and finding air. He walked in and saw me and stopped. He looked in that first second like himself, like Daniel. Like the person I had built 4 years around. The dark hair, the face that belonged in a film rather than a bookshop. And then something shifted in his expression, the careful composure he had worn all day, probably like armor, and underneath it was something raw and exhausted and frightened that I had never seen on him before or never correctly identified. Marcus, he said. Don't, I said, not loudly, quietly. He closed the door behind him. He didn't move further into the room. He stood near the door with his bag still on his shoulder, like he wasn't sure he had the right to put it down. Need to know one thing first, I said. Before anything else, one thing, he nodded. Was any of it real? The question cost me something to ask. I could feel it, a physical sensation like pressing on a bruise, because the answer mattered enormously and I was terrified of both possible versions. If it wasn't real, I had spent 4 years loving a performance. If it was real, I had spent 4 years loving a man who had decided that was not enough, that I was not enough, to make him tell the truth. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were bright in a way that I had only seen once before, when his mother had been sick 2 years ago and he had cried in the dark next to me, and I had held him and believed I was holding all of him. Of it, he said, every single part of it. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I need you to explain to me, I said, how a person does this to someone they love. He talked for a long time. He told me about his father, the kind of man who runs a company the way some people run armies, with absolute certainty about the correct order of things. Who had told his son, in explicit terms at the age of 19, that there was a version of his life that was acceptable and a version that was not, and that the unacceptable version would cost him everything: family, inheritance, name, belonging. Jonathan Harmon. And I had to force myself to use that name, to practice it in my head, to begin the process of reassembling this person into someone I had never actually met, had spent his 20s trying to be the acceptable version. He had built the architecture of it carefully, the right woman, the right house, the right suburb, the right life. And then he had moved to the city for work, and he had walked into a bookshop on a Tuesday in October and reached for a copy of Giovanni's Room, James Baldwin's novel about a man unable to live honestly in the life he has chosen, and a stranger had knocked books off the shelf next to him. I didn't plan this, he said. I need you to believe that. I wasn't looking for this. I thought I could keep everything separate. You thought you could have both, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, you thought that as long as nobody found out it wasn't hurting anyone. I told myself that. He paused. I knew it wasn't true. I knew it wasn't true from very early on, but I couldn't. He stopped, started again. I couldn't imagine losing you, and I couldn't imagine losing my family. And I didn't have the courage to choose. So you let someone else make the choice, I said. You let 4 years go by and then you let your wife make the choice. And until she did, you were just going to keep what? Commuting between us, making us both coffee, going home on Sunday nights and showing up here on Tuesday evenings and just... My voice broke on that last word. I had not meant it to. I took a breath. I was going to tell you, he said. I know how that sounds. I know you have no reason to believe it, but I was building toward it. The last few months, the reason I seemed distant, I was trying to figure out how. I was so close to... Don't, I said again, quietly, still quietly. Please don't tell me you were about to do the right thing. Please don't do that to me. He closed his mouth. We sat in silence for what felt like a very long time. She know? I asked finally. Caroline. Did she know you were? Did she know about you? He looked at the floor. She suspected, not about you specifically, not at first, but she knew something was. She knew who I was in some part of herself. I think she had known for a long time. We never said it out loud. It was easier not to. It was easier not to, I repeated. I know. You know what the worst part is? I said. I was surprised by how steady my voice was. The worst part is that I understand it. I understand being so frightened of losing everything that you make yourself very small and very quiet, and you try to just maintain, keep all the pieces in place and not look too directly at any of them. I understand that. But Daniel, Jonathan, whoever you are, you didn't make yourself small. You made me small. You made me into a piece of a life I didn't know I was in. You took away my ability to choose. He looked up at me then. And his face it was broken open in the way that faces rarely are, the careful architecture of composure completely dismantled, and I could see in it something that was unmistakably grief, unmistakably real, and I hated that it made me feel something, because I wanted to feel only one clean thing, and I felt approximately 17 complicated things simultaneously. I know, he said. I know, and I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know there's nothing I can say that is enough. But I need you to know that loving you was the realest thing I have ever done. That is the truest thing I know. He left that night. He didn't ask to stay. He didn't beg. He took a bag, just one, a duffel. His work clothes for the week, and he stood at the door for a moment and he looked at the apartment, at all of it, my books on his shelves and our mugs side by side on the counter, and I saw him memorizing it. Arrange for my things, he said. I'll do it when you're not here, whenever you say, anudad, muckers. He was still at the door. I know you probably don't believe this right now, but I hope someday, I hope you can forgive me. Not for my sake, for yours. I looked at him for a long moment. I don't know who you are, I said. I thought I knew everything about you. I didn't know your name. I absorbed that. He nodded once, a small, defeated motion, and then he left. And the door closed. and I sat in the apartment that had our life in it, or the life-shaped object that had been standing where our life should have been, and I finally, with nobody watching, came completely apart. The weeks after were the strangest of my life. Grief is strange enough when the person is gone. Grief is a different and more disorienting animal when the person existed in two forms simultaneously: the person you loved and the person you didn't know you were loving. I was grieving Daniel, who was real in every way that mattered to me, and trying to make sense of Jonathan, who was also real, who was a man trapped inside a story his father had written for him, who had done something I could not defend but who had not been, I was increasingly certain, cruel. Weak, yes, dishonest, catastrophically, but not cruel. There is a difference, a narrow and painful one. I called Caroline once, about 3 weeks after. I don't know exactly what I needed. Company in the specific, strange loneliness of this situation, maybe the only other person in the world who had been in this same story without knowing it. We talked for almost 2 hours. She was, I discovered, remarkable, dry and funny and honest in a way that surprised me. She said she had known, on some level, for probably 2 years. She said she had loved him, loved Jonathan, in the way you love someone you have built your life around, which is different from the way she should have been loved, which is the way she intended, going forward, to let herself be loved. She asked me if I was okay. I told her I was working on it. Her's in therapy, she said, near the end of the call, not defensively, just informatively, like she thought it was something I should know. His father found out. There was a conversation. It was apparently very bad. He's cut off, more or less. He told me he's trying to figure out how to actually be himself for the first time. I was quiet for a moment. St, I said, and I meant it. I was astonished to discover that I meant it. Prayer took me to a terrible karaoke bar 2 months after and made me sing Alanis Morissette at the top of my lungs, and it was the first time I laughed, actually, unguardedly laughed, since January. I held on to that laugh afterward like it was proof of something. I went back to therapy. I told my therapist everything, beginning with the bookshop and ending with the coffee still hot on the counter. She said something that stayed with me. The love you gave was real. It didn't become less real because he was lying. You loved someone genuinely. That's not a thing to be ashamed of. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it on the Tuesday evenings. I stopped spending in bookshops because bookshops had been contaminated. And then on the Tuesday evenings I started going back because I refused to let that be taken from me too. I thought about it when I lay in the dark in the apartment, my apartment now, just my name on the lease, books rearranged on the shelves so the gaps weren't visible, and tried to locate the part of myself that still believed in things. It was there. Smaller, more careful, bruised in specific places. But there, I heard from Jonathan once more, 8 months after the end, a letter. An actual paper letter, handwritten, which felt both anachronistic and right, like he understood that some things require more than a text message. It was 3 pages, and I'm not going to reproduce what it said because it belongs to me and to what we were, and some things should remain private even in the wreckage of a relationship. But there was one part I will share, because it is the part that made me understand something I had been trying to understand for 8 months. He wrote, I built Daniel because I needed somewhere to put all the parts of myself my real life had no room for, and then I made the worst possible mistake. I gave those parts to you. I gave you the most real version of me that existed, and then I made it impossible for that realness to be honest. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm writing because I needed you to know that the person who loved you was me, not a character, not a mask, me. I read that letter 4 times, and then I folded it carefully, put it in the back of my desk drawer, and went to make coffee. A year after the phone call, January, a Tuesday, I went to the bookshop. I didn't plan it as a meaningful gesture. I just needed a book, and it was the closest bookshop, and I was not going to spend the rest of my life making detours around a fiction aisle because of a man who hadn't even given me his real name. So I went, I found a novel I'd been meaning to read, paid for it, and was heading for the door when I nearly walked directly into a man coming in from the street. We did the awkward sideways shuffle, both going the same direction, then overcorrecting. Sarah, he said. My fault, I said. He held the door for me, and I thanked him and stepped out into the cold January air and stood on the pavement outside the bookshop with my novel under my arm and the city moving around me in all its enormous, indifferent aliveness. And I thought, okay, not fine, not healed, not arrived at some clean, resolved version of myself, but okay, present. In my own life, in my own name, knowing who I was in a way I had not quite known before all of this, because sometimes the things that destroy us also, slowly and without our permission, teach us the precise coordinates of ourselves. I thought about Daniel, about Jonathan, and I felt what I felt. The complicated residue of real love for a person I had not entirely known, grief and anger, and something that was beginning, very faintly, to resemble the early stages of peace. I thought about Caroline, who I had texted on New Year's and who had texted back a string of very dignified confetti emojis. I thought about Priya, who was meeting me for dinner in an hour. I thought about my therapist. I thought about the coffee my mother made when I had finally, 3 months after the call, driven home to see her and sat at her kitchen table and told her everything, the way she had not said a single word until I finished, and then had put her hands over mine and said, "Oh, sweetheart, you loved someone, that's what you did. Don't you dare be ashamed of that." I thought about Giovanni's Room, which I had reread in the months after, slowly, carefully, differently than I had read it before. About the way James Baldwin understood, 60 years before I stood outside a bookshop on a January afternoon, the specific devastation of a man who cannot make himself honest, and everything that devastation costs the people who love him. I thought about the coffee, still hot, on the counter. I stepped off the pavement and started walking. The city opened out ahead of me, loud and cold and full and real. My name was Marcus Webb. I was 27 years old. I was not okay yet, but I was moving in that direction, one January Tuesday at a time. That was enough. That was, for now, more than enough.